Well, welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. I've got a real pleasure tonight to introduce you to the Honorable Hugh Segal. Mr. Segal, Hugh Segal has got an illustrious political career, probably best known for his time as a senator in the Senate of Canada, but also that he was a principal advisor to both Prime Minister Brian Mulroney as well as former Premier Bill Davis, someone who I've respected for a great deal of time. And just recently, he's come out as part of a group that are supporting that the Canadian government should not agree to the extradition of the CFO of Huawei to the United States and should allow her to return to China. So, Mr. Segal, do I call you Honorable Mr. Segal or former Senator, or what's the appropriate salutation, sir?
I think Hugh is just fine.
Sir, tell us the situation if you could, please.
Well, look, I think that Canada has found itself caught as the meat in the sandwich in a game of trade pressure between the Americans and the Chinese. Let's just look at the facts. The charges against Mrs. Meng, the CFO of Huawei, were issued several months before the extradition request was made to Canada. During that period of time, the CFO of Huawei visited a whole bunch of European countries pursuing her company's business, South American countries, Caribbean, all of whom had extradition treaties with the United States. But it wasn't until she arrived in Canada that they issued the extradition order. Why would that be? She arrived in Canada on December the 1st. Several hours later, in Asia, there was a meeting of the G20. Mr. Trump and President Xi of China were going to be present. And at that very meeting, where there was a side discussion on trade matters between the Chinese and the Americans, President Trump said he'd be delighted to trade Mrs. Meng back to China for a better trade deal for Americans. So let's be clear what we got caught up in here by the Americans. And just so we're clear, and I don't question the good faith of our government or our Prime Minister's best efforts on this file, but just to be clear, this happened 5 years earlier. In 2014, a Chinese national by the name of Su Bin was arrested in Vancouver on request by the Americans as a result of him having been alleged to be involved in espionage activities against the United States, hacking military data sets, the Pentagon, and the rest. He was arrested by Canada in that process, and guess what the Chinese did? They went and arrested 2 Canadians. One was a minister of the cloth. Another was his wife, missionaries, who had been running a center in a rural part of China, who were guilty of no wrongdoing, and they were put in prison. So I don't question the goodwill of the government of Canada on this issue, but let's be clear. We know that President Trump has very little regard for our Prime Minister. I happen to think that speaks well of our Prime Minister, but nevertheless, there you have it. We know that we wouldn't bother him at all to put Canada in this kind of vice in order to get a tiny inch of advantage in his negotiations with President Xi. But I do blame the Department of Foreign Affairs and others for not advising the Department of Justice when this request came through that this had happened 4 years earlier, and the result of seizing someone under that American extradition order would be the arrest of 2 Canadians, innocent Canadians in China, for a period of time in jail. Now, in the first case, in Mr. Su Bin's case, he ended up cutting a deal with the Americans, going state's evidence, and assisting them in their anti-Chinese espionage activities. That resulted, guess what, in the release of the 2 Canadians being held by the Chinese. So this is not a new event. This is an old record, except now we have 2 Canadians who've been in prison for over 500 days in small 10 by 10, lights on 24/7 cells, and no effort on the part of the Americans to speak of to alleviate this problem. So the group of us who signed the letter, and there were some folks who had been ambassadors in China and the United States and Europe and at NATO and in other countries around the world, including who sat on the Security Council when Canada had a seat on the Security Council. Between them, they had, I don't know, about 400 years of practical diplomatic experience, who said, there is no way for us to huff and puff and get the Chinese to change their policy or release our Canadians. The law under which our extraditions operate in Canada, which was amended by a Liberal government actually, back in 2009, makes it very, very clear that, it was a Conservative government, back in 2009, makes it very clear that the Minister of Justice has the right to stop any extradition process if he deems it to be not in our national interest. He has the right to do so. We have already seen this process drag on endlessly. We've already seen the judge who's in charge of this process, to her credit, say she's worried about how long it is taking. So the case that was made in the letter was the Minister of Justice has the right to end this extradition treaty, and he should use it, because that's the only way, A, to get our two fellow Canadians home who are guilty of no wrongdoing, safe and sound. And then that allows us to have a more frank and open discussion about China in a way we are not intimidated by what they might do to these two Canadians who've now been charged with espionage, which means they could face a long and difficult trial. 99% of people who are sent to trial in China are convicted. And, they could be facing more difficulties than they are now facing now. And we are of the view, those of us who signed the letter in good faith, that the government has the right, in the assertion of Canadian sovereignty, in the assertion of a kind of understanding of the real world, to act in this case. And one other point. The person who is now leading in the polls in the United States, President candidate Biden, is against the very sanctions against Iran that Trump imposed, under which Mrs. May has been charged. So the notion that we could be sitting here on the 7th of January, 2021, with a new president who does away with the sanctions, and then we find we have these two Canadians who sat for another 4 months in prison under terrible circumstances because we got this request from the American president for the express purpose of bringing pressure to bear in fee and trade negotiations. That strikes me as not a serious conduct of foreign policy, which should be first and foremost protect the interests of Canadians at home and abroad in every circumstance.
And how do you respond to those that say, rule of law, we always go by the rule of law, we don't give in to bullies, we don't give in to ransom?
Well, I would say two things. If the nature of the American request for extradition was really a tight matter of rule of law, we get many extradition requests all the time for people who are alleged to have committed murder or bank robbery or bank fraud or whatever, and we act in a normal way. But this was clearly something that was about something beyond slam dunk criminality. This was about American trade negotiations. And I think we should have the capacity to discern the difference between the two, number one. Number two, the notion that whether we stick with the American extradition treaty or we don't will have any impact whatsoever on how China comports itself in the future under the new, much more authoritarian administration than we've seen in the past, I think is the height of self-conceit on our part and a little bit of naivety. China is the second most powerful organization in the world economically. They are growing their military might substantially. And what we may or may not do on this particular case is important to us, but it's not going to be of any great importance to the Chinese until their individual is released from custody. And the Americans, already having politicized this process for what I would call trade negotiation purposes, would be in a pretty hard place to allege that we're violating the rule of law in Canada when they weren't really following it very carefully when they issued this request to begin with.
What do you think will happen to the relationship between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump if he releases the CFO of Huawei?
I would say nothing of substance. We have disagreed with the Americans over the last 40 years on a whole bunch of issues. We've disagreed on Central America. Canada has disagreed on the Middle East. We have disagreed on Cuba. The main core substance of our relationship has continued. There have been spats between American presidents and Canadian prime ministers in the past. Mr. Chrétien did not send troops to Iraq, despite pressures from the Bush administration to do so. It didn't affect our relationship in any meaningful way at all. I think we have much more room to protect our national interests, and in fact, we should have a foreign policy that is much more focused on protecting our national interests while still maintaining those relationships that count. And while I'm not in any way soft or forgiving about Chinese authoritarianism, what they're doing to Hong Kong, what they would like to do to Taiwan, what they're doing in the South China Sea, I think all of that is reprehensible. We have to make sure that we maintain our capacity to deal with those issues on their merits and not be deemed as unable to do so because of political pressure from the United States.
What do you think China's response is going to be if we actually deliver the CFO of Huawei to the United States?
My instinct would be that the two Canadians would be home within the week.
Sorry, I meant if the CFO is sent to the United States.
Oh, I'm sorry, to the United States. My instinct is that there'll be no improvement in our relationship, and the Canadians will stay in a hostage circumstance for who knows how many months or years to come, and they may then take out their anger on the United States. But the United States is a much more substantial economic and political power than we are, more substantial military power. So the Chinese will not be quite as able to bully them as well as they have been able to bully us.
And you've pointed out that this has happened before. So I guess you're not bothered by the fact that you would be setting a precedent that whenever you disagree with an extradition, all you have to do is charge a couple Canadians that happen to be in your domestic area.
Well, the Chinese have done this to other countries. They've done this to Australia. They've done this to European countries. This is not a new phenomenon. The issue is, how do you deal with the interests of the legitimate interests, the life interests of those two Canadians being held in prison? And how do you do it in a way which asserts our authority under our law? When you talk about the rule of law, there's another law here. It's called the extradition law. And the extradition law says the minister has the right to stop something that is not in the national interest. It's a judgment he has to make. I don't question his good faith in the matter either, or the prime minister. But the purpose of the letter was to say we need to have this discussion, because not discussing the issue, not looking at the options, only plays into the hands of Trump's politics on the one hand, which is putting Canada in a terrible squeeze, and Chinese recalcitrance to give any consideration at all for the circumstance Canada is in.
So you put together quite an illustrious group of people to sign this.
I mean, I didn't put it together. I was asked to join it. I think it was other people of more substantial diplomatic background who did that. But as to why we all came together, I think your question will apply.
Okay, so this group has come together, and I was extremely impressed with both who signed it as well as what was written. Why hasn't the Prime Minister and the Government of Canada agreed with you so far?
Well, to be fair, when the letter was written, it was written as a private letter to the Prime Minister. And it was not our anticipation that it would be leaked and made public. We always knew there was a risk of that in the real world. And we would have hoped that the Prime Minister would have had some time to ask the very question that we asked in the letter, for example, about the legal opinion that was supplied by a very distinguished criminal practitioner about the rules under which the minister could act to end an extradition process under the law, the other rule of law. And so we were saddened that the Prime Minister did not get that opportunity because it was leaked. And I thought the Prime Minister's response indicated that he is a little bit trapped in his own rhetoric on the issue, and this happens to all good politicians, no matter what their intent is. You've said something so often in the past, you can't imagine changing your mind or being seen to change your mind because you'll be worried that that be seen as a sign of weakness. Well, I am always concerned about politicians who stand so solely on principle, so intensely on principle, that they don't really reflect on the human circumstances in the context. And I would argue that the best leaders begin with a core belief in core principles, but are sensitive to the human issues on the ground, are prepared to change their view or moderate their view when there are clearly important nuances that have to be considered. And I would say, Prime Minister, with the greatest of respect, he was polite about it. He rejected the proposal in the letter pretty directly in a press conference. So what's happened since? There are many other things underway, he said, to release these two people. Well, what might that be? Where's the evidence of something substantial happening? And I would argue that the government doesn't have any other options other than to pray that somehow the court proceedings move ahead and somehow the extradition request is set aside by a judge in our judicial system, and that could go on for another 2 years.
Is the fact that we're in a minority government and the Conservative leadership hopefuls have been calling Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, weak, play into this?
Well, I think opposition parties do what opposition parties do. I've been in opposition. I've been part of that. I know how that works. And it is their job to be critical of the government, to hold the government to account, and I give them credit for that. But the bottom line is there are three parties in the House of Commons that have an essential working ad hoc majority: the Liberal government, the New Democratic Party, and the Bloc Québécois. There is no evidence, not any, that if the Prime Minister decided to let his Minister of Justice exercise his right under the law to end the extradition process, and those two Canadians came home, Mrs. Meng was shipped to China, that would in any way produce a confidence vote in the House of Commons that the government of Canada would lose. No evidence at all.
Final question, is there any similarity here to the SNC-Lavalin case? Is the Prime Minister allowed to influence the Minister of Justice, or is the Minister of Justice required to make this decision on their own judgment?
Brian, the law says it's the decision of the Minister of Justice to do this. The difference, if I may say so, between the two was that the SNC-Lavalin case was a question of a criminal prosecution against a Canadian corporation that was already before the court. Criminal prosecution. The extradition matter is not a criminal prosecution. It is a petition to the courts to dispatch someone to another country where they would then face a criminal prosecution. There's quite a difference between the two, and in both cases, the law establishes the right of the Minister of Justice to act in one way and very differently in the other. In this present case, it says the Minister of Justice can act to end an extradition process when he or she thinks it's in the national interest. In the other case, it is the Director of Public Prosecutions who makes the decision about prosecution. The law is very clear on that. And I think in that case, the government was trying to find some way to put issues before the Minister of Justice, which might influence her authority under the Act, and that became problematic. But the two issues are very different, and the way in which the law operates are actually very different as well.
Honorable Hugh Segal, former member of the Senate of Canada, former advisor to Bill Davis and Brian Mulroney, and long-term political advisor, activist, author, columnist, etc. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thank you so much for the service that you provided to Canada over the years. And sir, if you ever want to tell your story about any of your political career, just give us a call. We'd love to have you back on our show. Thank you, Brian. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you. Well, that was a fascinating interview with former Senator Hugh Segal, Honorable Hugh Segal. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to have one of the leadership hopefuls for the Conservative Party of Canada. So stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio on Saga 960. Well, that was an absolutely fascinating conversation with one of the oldest Tory conservatives that I know, Hugh Segal, former senator, advisor to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, advisor to Bill Davis, and an illustrious political career. And now we're going to turn to a young, or younger at least, much younger conservative activist who's actually put his name forward to be the next leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, as well as obviously, if he is successful in that regard, he would like to run for and be your next Prime Minister. So I'd like to introduce you to Derek Sloan. Derek Sloan is currently an MP in the province, in the Parliament of Canada. He comes from Hastings, Lennox, Addington. He was elected in the 2019 Canadian federal election. And interesting enough, he's the first Seventh-day Adventist that's ever been elected to the Canadian House of Commons. Mr. Sloan, how are you? Welcome to our show.
I'm very well. Thank you for having me today.
Our pleasure. So, sir, why are you running to become the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada?
Well, like most conservatives, I believe that the best path forward for Canada is under conservative leadership. And I felt that our electoral tactics over the last couple of sessions, which I describe as basically focusing on a few issues like the economy and maybe a little bit of liberal corruption, focusing on negative attack ads and things like that, are not enough to win. We need to be a leading party, not just an opposition party. So we have to move from criticism to putting forward a bold plan to re-energize Canada and have answers to all concerns that Canadian citizens have, not just economic ones. And the economy, of course, is very important, but there's more issues than that.
So you're a newbie elected to Parliament. How do you think you compete with people of the like of Peter MacKay and Aaron O'Toole and Dr. Leslie Lewis?
Yeah, so I mean, there's different types of life experience, and of course, Dr. Lewis has no political experience in terms of being an elected member of Parliament, but she has other experiences. I have small business experience. I have family experience. I think that the Conservative members want someone who will speak the strongest on conservative values and will be someone who doesn't back down to political correctness in the media and elsewhere. They want someone who will toe a strong line, not water down the message. And I believe whoever can do that the best will win.
What are conservative values that you think people haven't focused on enough?
Well, there's a lot of values. I mean, there's values in the quote unquote social conservative sphere, which we can talk about later, but there's also issues that are not considered typically conservative. For example, housing and drug addiction and poverty and these types of things. So we need to have a full spectrum plan, but we also need to be strong on issues like political correctness, free speech. And there's sort of two different views in the party. One is kind of water down and go to the center, and one is stand strong in conservative principles.
So one of the issues that people have talked about you having that are reasonably controversial are some views on LGBT issues. Is that the social conservative values that you're going to be espousing in the race?
Well, you know, I haven't said, and it depends on who you talk to, how the very issue is framed. And I believe there's a conservative way to frame the issue, and there's a liberal way to frame this issue. Nothing I've said would take away rights from any group in Canada. What we're talking about, and particularly my comments on Bill C-8, have to do with protecting children, and we can talk about that later if you like. But we live in a country where there's a lot of different views on sexuality, and of course, sexuality is a complicated topic, and I don't think the government needs to be enforcing any one particular view on how that should work. People should be free to make up their own minds and to live their life as they choose. And that's a true conservative principle. When it comes to Bill C-8, which I've been very outspoken on, this is a bill that deals with gender dysphoria in kids. So this is something that not a lot of us are too familiar with. But what we're seeing is a spike in the number of kids that are identifying as transgender. I sponsored a petition today that is calling for a national inquiry into the reason why there's so many more kids in the foster care system, 8 or 9 or 10 times more, who are identifying as transgender. And what's happening to these kids is they're getting put on a stream that's putting them on these puberty blocking drugs and eventually surgical sex change operations. We also know that many kids will grow out of this, by the time they reach puberty. So many kids who go through a phase of identifying as a different gender, and the latest studies are showing over 80% of kids grow out of this. So that's why you see countries like the UK banning surgical sex change operations for kids under 18. This is a child safety issue, and the Liberals' Bill C8 says to parents, if you take your child and try to get them counseling to make them comfortable with the body they were born with, you could go to jail for 5 years. That's what the bill says, and the therapist could go to jail as well. This is not what Canada is about. There's ways to go too far on the left and right. This is going too far on the left, and I haven't met a single person who's a real parent or a real Canadian voter that would disagree with me on that issue so far.
In the last election, the Conservative Party couldn't make real inroads in suburban Canada, around Toronto, around Montreal, around Vancouver. You had to win if you were going to win the majority government, and Stephen Harper wasn't able to do that. And why is the question to you? What do you need to do to be successful in suburban Toronto?
Yeah, so there's a lot of issues there. So the first issue, which may seem counterintuitive to some, so Andrew Scheer espoused social conservative values, but did nothing to stand up for them. So to those people who hold those values, and a lot of new Canadians hold family values, so to speak, you can't say one thing and do another. So holding those values turned him off to a certain sector, doing nothing about them turned him off to the other sector. So you have to stand strong on certain values. You have to pick which side you're going to be. And if you're going to stand on certain values, you have to do something about it. The other thing is that we need to have a plan that speaks to urban issues. And we had very little in our plan to deal with affordable housing, for example. There's many issues that touch on the GTA and the 905 we didn't really talk about. We also were afraid to talk about our environmental plan, and I can talk about that a little bit later. We were content to just have a plan, but we didn't really want to push forward with it. We were basically saying, yeah, we have a plan and it's pretty good, but let me tell you about this tax cut. So we didn't push our environmental plan. We didn't have many GTA-centric plans, and it's very easy to have conservative plans that speak to those issues. In fact, I have some that deal with housing. So
tell us, what is your housing plan then?
Yeah, so housing, as you know, living in the 905 or the GTA has been on the top of everybody's mind. It's very challenging for people who are younger getting out of school to buy any form of house at all. There's actually three different things that are going into that. So immigration, we have more immigrants settling in the GTA than there is housing for them. And I've put up some information on my website. There's roughly 150,000 new immigrants that are settling in the GTA every year. There's under 30,000 new housing units that are available. Toronto has been one of the fastest growing cities from a housing perspective in the last several years. It's just a supply and demand issue. So I've said we need to reduce our immigration level. Right now it's at about 350,000 people per year to 150,000 people per year. We also need to deal with unrestricted foreign buying. So we have now a surtax that's applied in the Golden Horseshoe region of Ontario, but we need to do more than that. We need to look at how many people are buying, and we know anecdotally that there's people in other countries that are buying 5, 10, 15 condos at a time just to park their cash. We're seeing the same phenomena in BC. We need to make sure that residential real estate is reserved for Canadians, young Canadian families. Dealing with foreign buying. And the third issue is money laundering. And we know that there's a lot of money laundering going into real estate, and we're not doing enough to stop it. And there's been a variety of articles written on that, both in BC and Ontario. So those are the three ways to deal with housing.
And what's your environmental plan, sir?
Well, the environmental plan is really more about a philosophical difference. So instead of trying to say that our plan is the same as the Liberals, we need to say, listen, as a voter, you have two different choices here. You can vote for a plan that is based on climate alarmism, or you can vote for a plan that is conservationist. So a conservationist plan doesn't have carbon taxes. It would in fact pull out of the Paris Accord, but it would be chock full of real things that would impact the environment. So for example, we would target sewage dumping in the St. Lawrence. We don't have enough municipal infrastructure to deal with raw sewage. There's lists of many different things that we can deal with that have a definitive impact on the environment. Plastic waste, biodegradable packaging, reducing landfill waste, dealing with real things that impact the environment is what conservatives need to focus on. And that can bring us away from having to compete with liberal environmental plans, and people can have a stark choice.
But none of the suggestions on reducing garbage that you've talked about would impact climate change. So do you not believe that climate change is real?
Well, you say that, but I mean, the things that I'm talking about would also deal with emissions. But instead of dealing with carbon output or carbon quotas, we would be dealing with just making emissions generally cleaner. So focusing on cleaner air, cleaner water, cleaner soil. And an analogy I like to use is when you're dieting, you can focus on calories or you can focus generally on eating better. My view of the conservative plan is it would be generally focusing on eating better, which would have ramifications in other areas as well. But it's a different way of looking at it.
That's a good analogy. It's a helpful analogy. Last couple of weeks, last 2 months, frankly, race relations have become a huge issue. The city of Toronto last week debated a motion about defunding police. Cities across North America are doing that. What do you think about the Black Lives Matter issue and defunding police? Some people have suggested you made racist comments in the past, and I'm just wondering what you think about all that.
Right. Well, I mean, so the comments you're talking about are when I suggested that Dr. Theresa Tam should be fired. And of course, I didn't suggest that she should be fired because of her background, but because of the advice that she was giving us. And it since turned out that, everybody realizes that a lot of the advice that we followed was incorrect. But when it comes to Black Lives Matter and some of the protests, I certainly don't believe that police need to be defunded. There's always room for better training and so on with police. But the police perform a valuable service in keeping our communities safe, in keeping small businesses safe. One of the, small businesses would be hardest hit as we see police presence, if we were to see police presence removed from crime-ridden areas. The bigger corporations can afford the private security services. Small businesses often can't. So we need to make sure that we're protecting small business, that we're protecting. I mean, people in inner cities suffer from crime more so than others do. So what we're seeing right now with the protests is a lot of police are a lot more hands off now. They're less likely to get involved, and we're seeing an increase in crime, at least in the United States, in these inner city regions. So there's always room for better training and that type of thing. But certainly I don't believe in defunding the police.
So you believe because of the protests, police in inner cities are backing off, and that's led to an increased crime?
Well, I think so. I looked at some data actually that dealt with Baltimore, and they had some significant protests several years ago dealing with the death of somebody at the hands of the police. And you could see their murder rate go up quite significantly between 2016 and today. So, and we're seeing anecdotally other events. There was a young girl that was killed actually in, I believe it was Atlanta, but it was in one of the southern states. A young Black girl actually was shot just outside of a protest. And, these are things that, it's a byproduct of when we're seeing, obviously there's many legitimate protesters, but there's also a lawlessness element that can go along with some of these protests. And that's why we need the police. So
it sounds like you're the law and order candidate?
Well, I'm certainly in favor of law and order, and I'm also in favor of civil liberties, and I believe that police need to be held accountable. But certainly police perform a valuable function, and I don't think they should be defunded.
How do you think you're going to beat three reasonably experienced candidates, but a guy by the name like Peter MacKay that's been around for a long period of time, Aaron O'Toole who's been around longer than you? How are you going to beat them? What's your strategy?
Well, we're trying to hit on the conservative hard issues here, and conservatives are concerned about energy development. They're concerned about national sovereignty. They're concerned about free speech and cancel culture. And I believe I've been the strongest on all of those issues. And I believe conservatives, they don't really care what your name is. They don't really care what your portfolio is, in so much as they care, are you strong in the issues? And I think we've been showing that throughout every aspect of this race.
I think I see an electric guitar in the background. Are you a rocker?
Well, I used to play guitar a little bit more than I do now, but yeah, I played piano for many years, and I used to play guitar and bass guitar quite a bit a few years ago. So
Fantastic. Well, Derek Sloan, MP in the Canadian Parliament currently, and candidate for the Conservative leadership of Canada. Thank you so much for joining us. So really appreciate your time, sir. And if you ever want to come back and debate some more issues, just let us know.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Derek, very much. And good luck.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.